This video contains discussion of some heavy topics that may be difficult or triggering to some people. The CW's Nancy Drew is brilliant, and I'm the only one brave enough to say it. When the CW first announced they had a Nancy Drew TV series in the works, I was hesitant, to say the least. Over the near century since the character's creation, Nancy's relationship with film and television has been turbulent and unpredictable. From Pamela Sue Martin's Nancy being pushed out of her own show in favor of the Hardy Boys, to a 90s series absolutely no one talks about, to a failed CBS pilot, the girl detective has had little luck with television. In fact, aside from the well-known 2007 film starring Emma Roberts and game studio Her Interactive's long-running point-and-click mystery series, Nancy Drew seems to struggle translating the steadfast success of its books to other mediums. Combine this bad luck with the CW's penchant for taking beloved vintage intellectual properties and doing things like this.
I dropped out in the 4th grade to run drugs to support my nana.
That means you haven't known the triumphs and defeats, the epic highs and lows of high school football. But you will.
And I think you understand why I was skeptical. Now, I've been a fan of the Nancy Drew books almost my entire life, and I fell in love with the games my freshman year of college. It was about a decade ago that I decided we as a society were due for a good modern TV adaptation, even before the rights to one got passed around different networks like a game of hot potato. While the concept of a gritty reboot of children's media is kind of a joke at this point, I've always believed Nancy Drew was an IP that could pull it off. And I'm not alone. This show isn't the first to take Nancy to a more mature audience. Take, for example, the Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys comic series, The Big Lie and the Death of Nancy Drew. The comic is sort of a gritty, noir-esque take on the characters and their deep interpersonal conflicts in the face of systemic corruption and violent crime. By the way, if you at all follow the Nancy Drew sphere, you may remember the public uproar over the death of Nancy Drew. The premise was that Nancy had been murdered, and it was up to the Hardy Boys to solve the case. This was highly controversial as the comic came as a part of a celebration of Nancy's upcoming 90th anniversary, and people were understandably upset that Nancy was seemingly once again being pushed out of her own series and fridged to further the Hardy Boys' character development. Well, FYI, spoiler alert, though not really, it's revealed in the first issue, she's not dead. Because of course she isn't. I have so many issues with the comics, but that is not one of them.
Look how they massacred my boy.
Even the books themselves aren't afraid of getting a little grim. In the Nancy Drew Files, the 1980s reboot series, and my personal favorite book iteration, Nancy and her friends frequently find bodies stuffed in freezers, are kidnapped and left for dead, and get hit over the head so many times it's honestly a wonder Nancy doesn't suffer from permanent brain damage.
How many times have you been knocked out, anyway? I swear, one of these times you're gonna wake up in a coma.
Wake up
In book 20, Very Deadly Yours, the book's culprits kidnap Nancy, force her at gunpoint to write a suicide note, and push her out of a window. It's by sheer luck and plot armor that she survives. Hell, in The Haunting of Heliotrope Lane, book 16 of the current ongoing series being published by Simon & Schuster, The Nancy Drew Diaries, the culprit attempts to set fire to a house to commit insurance fraud. He attempts to cover up his crime by locking Nancy in the basement of said house before burning it down. The culprit describes to her in detail how the police will find her charred remains and assume she was just a trespasser who accidentally set the fire and got what was coming to her. This shit is for kids. But even if the books are primed for a more mature adaptation, I was still concerned. I think a lot of people struggle to get the character of Nancy Drew right. She's not some old-fashioned, born-in-the-wrong-century outcast. She's not some procedural police detective or femme fatale. But I really wanted to see someone take Nancy the way I saw her, the Nancy that I grew up looking up to, and give her the adaptation she deserves. So here I am to explain to you how I believe the CW did just that. When you open a Nancy Drew book, you find a pretty standard formula. Nancy, her friends Bess and George, who are cousins, and her boyfriend Ned head off on some adventure. Sometimes there's already a mystery afoot, sometimes they stumble into one along the way. However these characters start at the beginning, you can expect them to return to that point by the end. The books are episodic, self-contained stories with very little real character development or overarching plot. This makes perfect sense for this type of children's book. I should be able to pick up any of the titles off the shelf and read them in any order and understand what's going on. That's how these series and others like them were designed. There are a few exceptions, some multi-book arcs, but the overwhelming majority of these books work as standalone stories. But when it comes to television, especially television in the modern age, shows are expected to take a more serialized approach to storytelling. In the 1970s, when Pamela Sue Martin's Nancy emerged, episodic TV was more of the norm. After all, it wasn't realistic to expect your audience to follow some crazy season-long arc when there was no such thing as streaming, DVR, or even VCR tapes that could allow someone to catch an episode they may have missed. I mean, the 60s Batman TV series had 2-episode arcs, but the second episode always featured a lengthy recap of the previous episode and the events that led to whatever state of peril Batman and Robin were in. But now, as the TV medium has changed over the decades, continuity has become the norm. Audiences expect character development, and for actions to have lasting consequences. They expect things to change. That's what the CW's pilot promises, and the show delivers. This video will have minor spoilers at first. I'm going to discuss the premise as introduced to us and the major overarching mysteries Nancy solves over the whole season without spoiling them, but I will be spoiling a few individual episodes in order to make some of my points. I'll be discussing major spoilers later, but I will give warning prior to that section, so if you want to avoid them and watch the show for yourself, you can exit at that time. I highly recommend that. With that being said, let's dive into the CW's Nancy Drew. The show begins by introducing us to the 2 major mysteries on which the story will center, the murders of Lucy Sable and Tiffany Hudson. Lucy Sable was a teenage girl who vanished from the town of Horseshoe Bay in the year 2000 after being crowned Sea Queen. All that was ever found of her was her crown, a few strands of hair, and a bloody knife, all on the edge of the bluffs overlooking the bay. Dead Lucy allegedly haunts the town, waiting for her killer to be brought to justice. And yes, she is actually dead. This isn't some she was alive the whole time twist. Tiffany Hudson is the wife of Ryan Hudson, the wealthy heir to the Hudson fortune. One night, as Nancy works at the Bayside Claw and she and her coworkers serve the Hudsons along with their business associates, Tiffany ends up dead. This event is the catalyst for the rest of the series, as Nancy and her not-yet friends all become suspects and must work together to clear their names. Each one, aside from Nancy, has a motive. Ned Nickerson, aka Nick, was once wrongfully convicted of manslaughter, with Tiffany as the witness who put him away. Bess Marvin is found to be in possession of Tiffany's engagement ring and is a huge kleptomaniac. Ace, no last name. Actually, he has an alibi for the time of the murder, so he's cleared right away. And George Fan is, well, we'll unpack that later. Now, if you're a Nancy Drew fan who tuned into the pilot, you may have said, "This is nothing like the Nancy Drew I know," and turned it off. And I don't blame you. Looking back on the pilot now, knowing how the story ultimately progresses, I think it's a great pilot, one that does exactly what a pilot is meant to do. Introduce the premise of the show and its key players, giving the plot and characters a starting point with the promise of a path forward that the audience will want to stick around to watch. This pilot does that brilliantly. But if you're a fan of the source material, you may have seen that starting point and believed the show had failed to capture what makes Nancy Drew, well, Nancy Drew. But as I said, it's just the starting point, the promise of a path forward. Nancy isn't friends with her friends yet because the show wants us to go with her on that journey. Nancy has a strained relationship with her father because the show wants us to see how they overcome their conflict and develop the father-daughter relationship that is such a foundational part of the books. Now, the biggest deviation from the source material is probably the inclusion of supernatural elements. In her many years, Nancy has investigated a lot of ghosts.
Not talking about a ghost, are we?
We saw a light.
However, the stories almost always take a rational approach, allowing Nancy to uncover a logical explanation for whatever she's investigating. Although some of these explanations do feel inadequate, like in the games when carbon monoxide somehow causes everyone to hallucinate the exact same thing, or when Nancy proves the monster haunting the German village is just in a mask, a resolution which does nothing to explain the centuries of mysterious disappearances attributed to this legendary monster. Anyway, because of this relatively consistent dedication to reason, you might hesitate at the decision to deviate from that standard, and I understand. That was my biggest hang-up when the first promos for the show came out. But in my opinion, the show incorporates the supernatural in a way that actually enhances what makes Nancy Drew so great. There are no cop-outs, no disappointing "a ghost did it" deus ex machinas. Finding the solution to each mystery still relies on Nancy's intellect, her observation skills, her curiosity and perseverance. She interacts with the world the same way she always has. The only difference is that the world sometimes plays by different rules. Even when the supernatural is a solution to a mystery, there's always an element at its core that is deeply human. Also, one time the Hardy Boys and Tom Swift teamed up to fight actual aliens. Ghosts are like the least weird thing that's been added to the Drew-universe over the years. Really, the important thing is that the mysteries, supernatural or otherwise, are good. The writers know how to craft them, when and where to plant clues, and how to stick the landing. They allow the audience to share in the satisfaction of the resolution when they're able to put the pieces together, and delight in the shock of unforeseen twists. The mysteries aren't unsolvable, but not so obvious that it feels like the show has a flashing neon arrow pointing to the culprit. Upon rewatch, I find myself noticing more subtle clues that I previously missed. They have all the elements of what makes a strong mystery story with a satisfying resolution that feels earned. Nothing feels accidental or frivolous in this show. There have been plot threads introduced that get called back to and solved nearly 2 seasons later.
Looks like they left in a hurry.
Looks like they straight up vanished.
The episodes work to emulate the Nancy Drew books at their best. There are also puzzles that feel like they were pulled straight out of the games, such as in Season 1, Episode 3, when Nancy and Nick follow the clues in a series of portraits and the names of the authors featured in them to find the small fortune Tiffany bequeaths to him. I could totally see this puzzle being one I would have to solve as Nancy in the next installment of Her Interactive's point-and-click mysteries. That is, if they ever release another one, I am not holding my breath. Point being, the show does an incredible job capturing the spirit of intrigue and discovery the books are beloved for. But they don't just capture the spirit of it. They add something new, a human element. That human element is a huge part of what makes this show work, not just in regards to the supernatural, but to the characters overall. The show explores the human side of Nancy Drew we don't often see. As I said, the episodic nature of the books makes it difficult for real character development to take place. Nancy, Bess, George, and Ned all have certain character traits that flesh them out and distinguish them, sure, but the view we get of these characters is mostly surface level, even in books like the Nancy Drew Diaries, which are written in first person. Here's what I mean. As I mentioned, Nancy often finds herself in dangerous, frightening situations. Setting aside the lasting physical trauma getting hit over the head 1,000 times would do to you, in the real world, getting kidnapped and threatened with bodily harm and death on a regular basis would have a lasting psychological impact on someone. The books don't really touch on this, and I don't expect them to. That's not the intended focus of them, and though children certainly are capable of understanding more serious themes, that's not what they come to Nancy Drew books for. But in the show, the writers take the opportunity to explore the trauma Nancy and her friends face. They're allowed to struggle with the effects of their circumstances, to have conflict within themselves and with others that allows them to grow. The show demonstrates this right off the bat by making the decision to have Nancy's mother's death be a much more recent event in her life. The books have her mother dying when Nancy is younger, at least a decade removed from the events of the story, if not longer, and rarely, if ever, touch on the true impact such a loss would have on someone. Sure, Nancy brings up her dead mom a lot, so much that it's become a sort of meme within the fandom, but rarely do we see how this has actually affected her. In one of the games, The Silent Spy, Nancy follows clues about her mother's work in espionage and reflects on her relationship with her mother shortly before her death. The biggest criticism of that game is that it attempts to be sentimental without really committing to it. Nancy comes through this experience relatively unscathed, and it feels like this game could have been about any spy with little to no connection to Nancy, with the same result. On the other hand, Nancy Drew's humanity and the connection she shares with her friends and family is its foundation, and it's a solid one. The supernatural elements are simply vessels through which such themes can be explored. One episode I believe is a perfect example of the show's masterful blend of classic Nancy Drew and its original spin is episode 11 of season 2, The Scourge of the Forgotten Rune. The episode begins with Nick mysteriously losing his memory, and the rest of the Drew crew have to work to uncover the cause. It becomes a race against the clock when Nick's phone is found at the scene of a gruesome murder, making him the prime suspect. The group discovers that the victim had been researching a local Viking archaeological site and the team assigned to the dig, who have gone missing. They find the team's journals and determine the murderer is an ancient Viking god. But as Nancy is about to read its name out loud, the whole group suddenly wakes up in a parking lot with all of their memories wiped clean. It's revealed that the god kills whoever knows its name, a name which the victim accidentally revealed to Nick just before his death. What unfolds is a Groundhog Day-esque series of events in which the group, lacking their memories but not their intelligence, develop a plan, fail, and re-wipe their memories. Lather, rinse, repeat.
If you're watching this attempt 5, water gunning the entity with holy water did not work.
When every plan fails and it seems all hope is lost, Nancy refuses to give up. In the end, it's her classic deduction skills and the rest of the team's personal strengths that save the day. The entity kills all who know its name because the more who do, the weaker it gets. With George and Nick providing the distraction, Bess using her social media expertise along with Ace, who flexes his computer skills with a team of Chekhov's online bots introduced earlier as part of a red herring.
I'm running software to try and track down the Trollmaster.
And I'm scrolling through Instagram while we wait. Since we're announcing what we're doing.
The episode ends with their memories restored, the god defeated, and the seeds of new plot lines planted for future episodes. It's a fascinating premise that ties into the season's story arc that's well executed with excellent pacing and a satisfying conclusion. It's also a perfect example of the show's great sense of humor. This show is funny and not in the so cringe it's hilarious kind of way you find on certain other shows. I've found myself laughing out loud at this show, or rather, laughing with it, not at it.
Okay, why should we believe any of this? When George asks why we should believe any of this, because I said so. Okay, well.
Yet unknown. Mystifying.
This is a terrible podcast.
Nancy, did you kill someone?
What? No, Bess, this body was brought to the morgue today, and the next thing I know, it fell out of my cabinet.
You follow you home?
With her plucky sidekick, Nancy Drew.
Oh, plucky. Look, it's George's plucky sidekick.
George's what? So, I think that this body wants me to solve its murder. Are you sure this isn't you just feeling aimless and grasping for a sense of identity during your gap year?
Nancy got arrested. I got a bunch of dead people's parts.
Ooh, what parts?
Nancy got examine the body for a potential cause of death.
No, we're not performing an autopsy in your kitchen.
No, you're absolutely right, Nick. We should do it in the living room. There's more space.
But the show knows how to balance this humor well with its more serious subjects. A good example of this is in Season 2, Episode 14, The Siege of the Unseen Spectre. In this episode, Nancy investigates the case of a missing black woman whose 2013 disappearance is disregarded by the police when a young white girl goes missing at the same time. This young white girl's disappearance is, incidentally, the first case Nancy ever solved. The topic, of course, is a heavy one, with this episode airing not long after the George Floyd protests in 2020. The episode addresses the real violence black people face at the hands of law enforcement and the role those of us who aren't black play in perpetuating this violence. None of the suspects in this episode are entirely innocent, and while in the end there is a specific culprit, each person played a part in this woman's disappearance, and ultimately her death, as they acted on their biases, demonstrating how microaggressions, which are so often dismissed as being not a big deal, are a form of violence themselves. For the B-plot of this episode, the writers chose to ease up on their typical, more overt humor, instead choosing to give the audience a touching story involving George and the spirit of her great Aunt May. That doesn't mean the episode is entirely devoid of moments of levity. In fact, there are quite a few.
Why are you communicating through Ace?
Because I wanted to know what it's like to be a tall white man. So when you called on me, I thought, here's my chance.
But the episode is self-aware, recognizing the gravitas of its story while offering the necessary moments for the audience to breathe. The show not only addresses institutionalized racism, it also turns its back on the overwhelming whiteness of the source material. Nancy Drew has an unfortunate history tarnished by racism. The yellow-covered books you probably picture when you think of Nancy Drew are actually 50s and 60s rewrites of the original 1930s series, which are no longer in print due to their inclusion of stereotypes and even racial profiling of suspects. And if the 1950s calls and says you're being racist, you're probably being pretty fucking racist. Even the yellow books haven't aged well because of fucking course they haven't, they were written in the 50s and 60s. In addition to casting these familiar characters as people of color, the show offers Bess, George, and Ned complex backstories, something the books don't really touch on. All three of them are fleshed out, but I want to highlight Ned, or Nick as I will be calling the show's version, as an example. Now, would I call most iterations of Ned Nickerson a simp? Yes. Listen, I love Nancy, but girl, you gotta stop forgetting your anniversary and standing up your boyfriend to fly to Iceland.
I owe you a serious apology. I'm sorry.
It's all right, Nan. That's part of why we're celebrating this anniversary in the first place. You're passionate, and that's great, and part of why we're together. I've heard of getting stood up on an anniversary, but nothing quite like this. Just bring me an anniversary souvenir from your trip, okay?
Oh, you're the best, Ned. I'll make it up to you, I promise.
That boy is a saint. But I get it. Ned represents yet another aspect of Nancy's perfect life. She was designed to be someone young girls want to be. Intelligent, independent, with plenty of disposable income, and a perfect boyfriend whose life revolves around her. But in the show, Nick is allowed to be his own person. Both he and Nancy contribute to the downfall of their relationship in season 1, but it's ultimately Nick who breaks things off officially when he realizes that the walls Nancy puts up have made it impossible for him to truly connect with her. Allowing him to develop outside of his relationship with Nancy was a great decision.
Also, it manages to do that without fucking up his characterization and turning him into a character that is unrecognizable, unlike certain comic adaptations that...
I suspect the writers initially intended for them to get back together, as they always do on the occasion they break up in the books, but ultimately they chose a different route. Now, the walls Nancy tends to put up in her relationships ties in with the aforementioned themes of trauma and grief. This is another place in the show where the supernatural elements serve to enhance the human elements. Season 2 offers one of my favorite depression storylines on television, odd enough as that is to say. The show utilizes the supernatural to complement Nancy's struggles.
I did it. I brought Everett to justice, and I don't feel anything. No anger, no satisfaction, not even relief, just nothing.
Serving not as a scapegoat or cop-out for the narrative to explain away her pain, but as a tangible metaphor for the existing trauma present in her life. I don't want to spoil it here, but it's a wonderful story of finding the strength to carry the pieces of yourself that may be painful but have ultimately shaped you. And Kennedy McMahon is an incredible actor. I cannot understate the talent she brings to the role, both in her emotional gravitas and the more comedic moments. I truly believe she deserves to be as synonymous with Nancy Drew's place in television as Pamela Sue Martin. Hi, editing Jenny here. Going unscripted because I forgot to add this bit in, and you're going to very quickly realize why I meticulously scripted this video. So I wanted to add that I love that this show forces Nancy to make tough decisions. You know, the system does not always work in her favor, and that's realism. And I think that a lot of times shows and, you know, books and movies and whatnot fall into this trap of the idea that realism equals, you know, dark and edgy and, oh, the world sucks, it always sucks, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel, and I don't like that, and I think that's just kind of a trap that a lot of people fall into, but this show manages to have that realism while maintaining, you know, an underlying message of hope throughout the entire thing, and I really love that for the show. I really love that for the character of Nancy Drew, and I think it's just so good. It's just so fucking good, okay? Alright, back to the words that, you know, were written. I really like this show, folks. I like the major aspects of it which make up its core, and I like the smaller bits that help bring this world the writers have created to life. I like the attention to detail where flashes of group chats, newspaper clippings, wardrobe choices, etc. give us further insight into the characters. Honestly, even though it gives me a little bit of an existential crisis, making Nancy a Gen Z kid was a great choice.
Hey, so in the Stone Age of the 90s...
that the costuming department uses to its full advantage. Gen Z fashion is known for its use of vintage elements, and this allows the costume designers to integrate pieces into Nancy's wardrobe that give off a classic vibe that feels very authentic to the character without making her feel dated. And I love the ways in which the show cleverly incorporates its source material. If you're familiar with the books, you may be wondering why the show takes place in the town of Horseshoe Bay, Maine, when Nancy famously hails from River Heights, a town which has moved around over the years but is usually located a couple hours outside of Chicago. Aside from the writers and network possibly wanting to avoid any confusion or comparison to the town of Riverdale from, well, Riverdale, the name Horseshoe Bay makes perfect sense when you remember that the Hardy Boys series takes place in the town of Bayport, a horseshoe-shaped inlet located somewhere off the coast of New England. Also, Nancy's house is located on River Heights Drive, so there's that. Speaking of the Hardy Boys, remember Ace? Oh my god. Speaking of the Hardy Boys, remember Ace? He's not just the comic relief original character he comes across as in the pilot.
Can I come with you?
Nope, you cannot.
Hey, can I come with you?
Hey, no.
Hey, can I come with you?
Allegedly. Of course, the show can't tell us who he is. Hulu owns the TV rights to the Hardy Boys for this foreseeable future, so if the CW were to incorporate them into their show, the most they could do is tease us with hints and clues. 3 seasons in, we still don't know Ace's last name, or if Ace is even his real first name.
What do you want me to call you, Mr. Wait, what is your last name?
Probably a nickname not many people name their kid Ace. We meet his half-brother, Grant, in Season 2, and the show makes sure to let us know that that isn't his real first name. In Season 2, Episode 12, Nancy, Ace, and Grant team up to take on a crime syndicate known as the Road Back in order to save Grant's mother's life, and it feels like such a classic Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys super mystery. It really has that vibe.
Good hike?
Now, is this because the Hardy Boys were here all along? That I cannot say. Other details of Ace's life line up with the details found in the books, and he and his brother match their physical descriptions. Also, at one point, he gets possessed by a ghost by the name of Joe, and all I'm saying is they could have chosen literally any other name. They could have chosen any other name. Okay, I had a great segue into this bit, but I edited it out, so just pretend that I have a really great segue here. I am gonna enter spoiler territory now. Yay! So yeah, spoilers ahead. Major spoilers ahead, I mean. If perchance you are intrigued and want to watch this show, I suggest turning this off now so you get to experience the story for yourself. If you've already watched or been spoiled, or I haven't convinced you yet, or you just don't care, keep watching. Like I said, the major mysteries introduced in Season 1 are the murders of Lucy Sable and Tiffany Hudson. While these 2 murders occur almost exactly 19 years apart, they appear at first to be unrelated. However, as you may be able to guess, they are absolutely related. The show solves Tiffany's murder first, using its resolution to further the investigation into Lucy's death. Lucy was the high school girlfriend of Ryan, Tiffany's husband. Nancy uncovers a series of emails between Lucy and Ryan, love letters sent in secret to keep his father from finding out. The emails take a dark turn, however, when Ryan, or someone using Ryan's email address, sends Lucy a cruel, vindictive message.
I can't forgive you for what you did. You're a whore, just like everyone says. I hope you die.
Whoa.
Nancy suspects Ryan for both murders and seeks to prove it by staging a reenactment of the night of Tiffany's death. But this reenactment throws a wrench in the investigation as Nancy figures out that the poison food Tiffany consumed that night was never meant for her. It was meant for Ryan. In an instant, everything Nancy thought she had figured out about the case falls apart. Side note, I also just want to point out that earlier I said that Ace was the one person who had an alibi for the murder as he was on the kitchen security footage at the time. But as it turns out, Ryan sent back his meal because the salad had dressing on it. Dressing that just so happened to be the poisoned food in question. Don't know why I said that. That's not correct. The dressing was not poisoned. It was, the culprit snuck into the kitchen and put the poison directly on the salad. Yeah. Oops. And as the reenactment plays out, Ace realizes that he was the one who replated that same salad for Tiffany's meal. I just think that's like a fun little twist that the one person that we never even consider a suspect, on account of his very real alibi, is, unbeknownst even to him, the final piece in a series of events that seals Tiffany's fate. It doesn't really change anything, it's just a small, more subtle example of how well this show develops its mysteries. After Nancy discovers Ryan was the intended target, the real culprit comes to light pretty quickly. Josh, Lucy's half-brother. Josh, believing that Ryan was responsible for Lucy's death after seeing this email exchange, sought revenge and attempted to poison him. He tries to kill Nancy, fails, then fucks off for a few episodes until his dramatic return. A couple episodes later, we find out Karen, cop and former best friend of both Lucy Sable and Kate Drew, helped him acquire the poison, a poison sitting in evidence from a previous case. So that's one mystery solved, but the other remains. Who killed Lucy Sable? Lucy's case is an example of a common trope in media, the beautiful blonde white girl murdered or missing who haunts the small town, literally in Lucy's case, from which she was taken. As the town tries to move on, she loses her humanity, she becomes the town ghost, a campfire story, a beautiful tragedy defined by the mystery she leaves behind. We see this in shows like Twin Peaks, Veronica Mars, and Pretty Little Liars, where this mystery is the catalyst for the series. The public loves dead blondes. We don't have time to unpack it. As you may expect, it was not Ryan who killed Lucy. That would be too easy. Nor was it Carson Drew, who's arrested for the crime and spends the second half of season 1 awaiting trial. The evidence points to him being at the scene, his fingerprints on the knife found at the Bluffs, the knife which matches the incomplete set Nancy finds tucked away in her house. Lucy's bloodied dress also finds its way into the Drews' attic, mysteriously. Nancy is the first one to point the finger at her own father, but by the time he's arrested, she's convinced of his innocence, and races to find another explanation for this evidence and find the true culprit before her father gets put away. But he won't talk. He insists that he's innocent, but refuses to defend himself. Nancy suspects that he's covering for someone, with that someone possibly being her mother. Kate was connected to Lucy as her guidance counselor, but if she was somehow responsible, what would be the motive? In season 1, episode 16, The Haunting of Nancy Drew, Carson's grand jury hearing is fast approaching. Nancy, suspecting Kate Drew of being at the scene as well, discreetly sends her hair off to a lab for testing against the mystery woman's hairs found at the scene. She ends up on a hunt for Lucy's diary, hoping to find evidence of someone who may have wanted her dead. Nancy teams up with Ryan to find the diary and ultimately succeeds. When she's forced to testify at her father's hearing, she presents the diary as evidence and in doing so, puts the mystery of Lucy Sable to rest. Like I said, there are many shows that follow the formula of dead girl haunts small town. The show follows our protagonist as they seek out the truth, following the twisted, complicated mystery that was this young woman's life and death to find her killer. Lucy's story ends differently, however. Her murder isn't committed by some jilted boyfriend or an older man who preyed on her, or whatever person the writers decide makes the juiciest story. Her murder isn't a murder at all. Lucy Sable, after being ostracized and bullied by her peers and her boyfriend's disapproving father, and being isolated by her family, went to the Bluffs that night to kill herself. She took the knife she'd stolen from the Drews as their dinner guest, having been driven to her breaking point by a town that chose to turn her into a ghost story rather than face the truth of the part they played in her death. Nancy reveals this and exonerates her father, and in that courtroom we see Lucy Sable for the last time. But that's still not the end of the story. You might have figured out where this is going, but I'll spell it out anyway. Lucy Sable's death was a suicide. The case is closed, but Nancy can't help but believe there's still a piece missing. Lucy wasn't haunting Horseshoe Bay or Nancy Drew because no one had solved her murder. There was no murder to solve. Throughout the episode, Lucy's ghost tries to prevent Nancy from finding her diary and revealing the truth. She doesn't want the town to know her secret. So why was she haunting Nancy? When Nancy finally gets that missing piece, Carson is forced to come clean. The show plants a few clues earlier in the season that suggest Lucy was hiding something just before her death. This secret further isolates her from her family and friends. She's scared of what will happen if they know the truth. That night at the Bluffs, a distressed Lucy calls the one person she does trust, Kate Drew. Carson and Kate arrive at the cliff's edge to find Lucy clutching a newborn infant. Carson leaves his fingerprints and Lucy's blood on the knife as he cuts the umbilical cord. Lucy hands them the baby, her last words instructing them to keep her away from the Hudsons, and then she falls. Carson tells Nancy he doesn't know whether Lucy jumped or simply slipped. He looked away for a moment, and she was gone. Yes, the baby is Nancy. This revelation was, according to the writers themselves, their initial pitch for the show to the network, and I can see exactly why it got greenlit. I believe this storyline is what makes this show one of the best Nancy Drew adaptations of all time. I believe this show, through this storyline, breathed a new life into a formulaic intellectual property that desperately needed and deserved it. To illustrate my point, I want to call back to another well-known Nancy Drew adaptation, the 2007 film starring Emma Roberts. To be clear, by comparing these two, I'm not trying to say that the movie is bad. On the contrary, I really like it. What I want to do is compare how the CW executed their narrative with how the movie handled a similar plot. In the film, Nancy investigates the mysterious death of an actress that took place in Nancy and her father's own house decades ago. Nancy discovers that the actress was pregnant just months before her death. Part of the mystery is finding the actress's secret child, the sole beneficiary of her mother's will. Nancy finds the child, now an adult with a daughter of her own. There's a lot more that occurs after the discovery. Nancy finds the will and reunites the daughter with the father who never knew she existed, figures out who killed the actress, case closed, everybody's happy, next mystery please. It's good. It's fun. It feels for the most part like Nancy Drew. I like it. But compare this plotline and its resolution to the CW show. Nancy works to solve the mysterious death of a teenage girl that took place in her hometown nearly 20 years ago. The teenage girl hid a secret pregnancy just before her death. Nancy once again finds the woman's child, but this time it's Nancy herself. In the movie, the mystery is another entry in Nancy's case file. Of course, Nancy cares about the people she helps, but at the end of the day, she has no real attachment to the cases. There are no personal stakes outside of the threats of physical harm she encounters for getting too close to answers. When the dust settles, for her, it's off to the next adventure. Her character is in the same place she was before. And that works for a Nancy Drew adaptation. Like I said, the books are formulaic. Nancy is supposed to stay in the same place. It works in the books, and it works for the film. But the show doesn't just give Nancy a mystery to solve. It turns her into one. Nancy seeks an answer, believing herself an outsider looking in as she's always been, only to find she's been at the heart of it all along. Nancy cannot stop until she finds the truth that's part of her nature, but the truth in this case is something about herself she never expected or wanted to find. She spends much of the first season investigating the Hudsons as some abstract representation of corruption and greed and injustice, only to discover that they're her blood. Her new mystery is her identity, discovering who she is and how each of her families, her biological family and the one who raised her, has shaped her, putting the fractured pieces of her life back together. This mystery fundamentally changes her. By turning Nancy into an intrinsic part of its mystery, the show turns her into a person, not just the girl detective. That is the core of its story. It's such a satisfying narrative experience, and I wish to God more people would watch it because, to be honest, it has been a bright spot in my life these past few years as the world has fallen apart, and I want more people to experience that. The show has also reignited my desire to consume other Nancy Drew content, reading books I haven't read, rereading those I have, playing the games I love, solving the Nancy Drew Hunt a Killer mystery box, etc. The show made me remember why my love for this series has endured throughout my life into adulthood. This next bit was a lot longer when I initially recorded this, but I decided to condense it, so I rewrote it and re-recorded it. So if you're wondering why the audio is different, it's because I'm recording from a different setup. So just bear that in mind. Okay, here we go. I don't think this show is perfect, because no show is. I have critiques, though none of them really have anything to do with the deviations from the source material, except that I wish that they had practiced more size-inclusive casting for certain characters, and I also kind of wish they had made Bess and George cousins. I know that one's not really that important in the grand scheme of things, but either that or they Could have pulled a reverse Sailor Moon and turned them into a couple. I mean, they kind of did that, but not really, but kind of. I think the most glaring critique I have is the show's handling of the Bobbsey twins. While I'm sympathetic that the writers likely had to rework a lot of their plans for the characters after 2020 shutdowns and strict health and safety standards became a requirement on set, and probably limited what scenes could be filmed and how they were filmed, and I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt that what they initially planned was a lot better, but it ultimately did a great disservice to these characters who had great potential and kind of played into some harmful stereotypes, and I think that's important to acknowledge. I also don't know how to feel about Ryan Hudson as a character. As someone whose teens and early 20s were firmly situated in the Pretty Little Liars era of television, where relationships between adult men and teens were romanticized, season 1 of Nancy Drew is incredibly cathartic. The Drew crew don't pull their punches when it comes to Ryan's behavior, and George's speech at the end of season 1, where she tells Ryan how his actions have harmed her, is one of the best scenes in the show.
We talked about this. What we did was wrong, but...
No. What you did to me.
Now, when it's revealed that Ryan is Nancy's biological father, obviously he's going to play a larger role in the narrative and try to be present in her life, and it does take Nancy some time to not hate him, and he does realize that he's been a piece of shit and works to do better, and the show also, I think, does a decent job of acknowledging his own trauma without using it as an excuse for his behavior, but I feel like in season 3, he's just a little too comfortable with the main group. There should be more distance and hesitation on behalf of their friend. I understand that George's speech in season 1 is meant to sort of be a kind of nail in the coffin where she's said her piece, but I want the show to acknowledge how conflicting Ryan's place in Nancy's life and by extension her friends' lives would be for George. I also, though this is not the writers so much as the network, wish that the Tom Swift spinoff had received any promotion at all, because I learned the show was canceled before I ever knew it had aired, and because it's a show with a gay black lead and a large cast of black characters, I can't help but be a little suspicious as to why it didn't get promo. The timeline of the show is also really condensed. 3 seasons take place over the course of 4 or 5 months. But actually that might be a point in its favor because Nancy never ages at all in the books, and don't even get me started on the games. Those take place in a pocket dimension where time just is not a real thing.
Now, I don't know how to end this. I spent a long time on this script, trying my best to include all the talking points I intended to put in, and it still feels like, even though it's long, it's not long enough. I feel like there's parts I want to expand on more or articulate better, but if I try to keep working on this until I'm completely satisfied, it will never get done, and it will just be yet another abandoned, incomplete ADHD project, and I don't want that to be the case. I'm very passionate about this, and I've put in too much work already to quit now. This is gonna be a bitch to edit, but we shall try our goddamn best. If you made it to the end, I hope you enjoyed, and if I've at all sparked your interest in this show, or any other part of the Drewniverse, I suggest checking it out. Stay sleuthy, and remember,
you can do a thing half-assed or commit to it all the way.
This is a terrible
video.